Okay, we'll do some more quotes from the Holy Grail Wisdom Quotes by me, Pete Rogers. We're doing Richard Feynman. We're going in alphabetical order. He was the great physicist. Here's some things that he had to say. He lived from 1918 to 1988. He said, the best teaching can only be done when there is a direct individual relationship between the student and a good teacher. A situation in which the student discusses the ideas, thinks about the things, and talks about the things. It's almost impossible to learn very much by simply sitting in a lecture, or even by simply doing problems that are assigned. I would agree with him that the best form of learning is when you have a teacher who you admire and they're trying to help you. And that's like what the Oxford tutorial program is like. The PhD student will meet with their professors twice a week. They'll get some assigned reading. They'll be instructed to think about it and do some experiments on it and then come back and discuss it. That's a great learning. And also, if you look at the lives of most geniuses, I read biographies of a whole bunch of geniuses. It's very common. Richard Feynman is an example himself. They spent time talking to their fathers. And their fathers would run them through a series of questions about, daily experiences or encounters, and that would really help them to develop intellectually. There's some guys who got that from their mothers. That's less common, but, a good example would be John Ruskin. John Ruskin, reading the Bible with his mother, that really helped him develop his incredible style of writing. Anyways, getting back to Richard Feynman, I think, that's what's missing. You can learn a lot if the lecture is really unique and totally improves how something's explained or shows you new insights. And doing problems can help, but it more helps you to take another test. In real life, it's usually a conversation and ability to articulate a field that's most valuable. Okay, Richard Feynman, he says, study hard whatever interests you in the most undisciplined, irreverent, and original manner possible. Yeah, I think he's on to the idea that if you just study what's in the textbook or what was covered in class, usually, that'll help you get a good grade. But if you really want to be an expert, you should be able to converse on the subject from whatever direction the question comes from. And that means you're going to have to read non-approved textbooks, listen to what patients have to say, whatever. A lot of times the best information comes from less prestigious sources. For example, if you look at the medical books, all of the great nutrition doctors, not a single one is in the books. Dennis Burkitt's in the books for Burkitt's lymphoma. He's not in the books for abdominal pressure syndrome, which is, 10,000 times more important discovery than Burkitt's lymphoma. Okay, Dr. McDougall's not in the textbooks. Caldwell Esselstyn's not in the textbooks. Ornish is not in the textbooks. Pritikin, Kempner, Sloop, Richard Moore. None of these guys who did all the best stuff are in any of the textbooks. So they're not known. And if you're a new, young up-and-comer and you start mentioning these guys, nobody in the Ivy Leagues will know what you're talking about. Nobody in the big-name medical centers will know what you're talking about. And they're going to look down on you like, who are you, bringing up all these nobodies? And you're like, excuse me, they're the ones who figured out your field. Okay, I've had the experience that I'll go to meet the experts in a given field, and they won't even have read the basic introductory papers, okay? I had that experience with diabetes. I asked the internal medicine doctors, show me who are the best endocrine doctors, endocrinologists, the ones who treat diabetes all the time, and I went and talked with them. They had not read any of the papers. They didn't know J. Shirley Sweeney. They didn't know Hemsworth. They didn't know Rabinowitz. They didn't know any of the stuff on the papers. They didn't know the Brownlee paper. It's like, how could you not know the Brownlee paper? That's the whole foundation of diabetes research. Okay, anyways, Richard Feynman continues. I love to think, and I once considered taking drugs as an attempt to better understand an altered state of mind. However, I decided not to. I did not want to chance ruining the machine. Yeah, that's good advice. All drugs that affect your brain cause brain damage. All neuropsychiatric drugs cause brain damage. It's best to avoid them as much as you can. Peter Breggin, the greatest psychiatrist who ever lived, that's what he said. He said, every single psychiatric drug causes brain damage, and they all eventually lead to a lobotomy if you keep taking them. Especially those antipsychotics. They can do it rapidly. Okay, Richard Feynman continues. Why not turn the electron microscope for observing nano-sized structures into a tool for designing nano-sized structures? Okay, that's interesting. That's another sign of geniuses. They'll often just turn things upside down, and a lot of times that ends up being useful. Just look at your own life and ask yourself, how many times would it be useful to say to yourself, what if the opposite was true? What if the opposite was what's really happening? A lot of times that's how you can figure out if somebody's bullshitting you. If the opposite of what they're saying sounds more likely than what they're saying, they're probably bullshitting you. Okay, Richard Feynman continues. Physics is like sex. Sure, it may give some practical results, but that's not why we do it. Physics isn't the most important thing. Love is. Okay, he continues. The highest form of understanding we can achieve are laughter and human compassion. Okay. Okay, Feynman continues. He says the only way to deep happiness is to do something you love to the best of your ability. Okay, I think that's a good quote, and that kind of again sounds like what you hear from a couple different directions. Like Watson, the DNA guy who co-discovered the structure of DNA, he said, an animal is happy when it does what it's meant to do. A horse is happy when it runs. So if you enjoy learning and thinking, you'll be happy when you're learning and thinking. So try to find a job where you can do that. Yeah, and I've also heard it's a little bit like Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer said, you should forget about trying to have a happy life. Just try to have a heroic life. And if you try to have a heroic life and do the best you can with your current situation, your options, your context, you'll respect yourself, you'll like yourself, so you'll be happy. Happiness comes from who the person is. Okay, Feynman says, what I cannot create, I do not understand. Don't pay attention to the authorities. Think for yourself. Yeah, very often the official societal authorities are a joke. Like I said, all the best, endocrinologists in my area, not a single one knew the basic papers, the introductory level papers. I can tell you, the rheumatologists I've talked to, they don't know what leaky gut is. How could you treat autoimmune disease when you don't know that? Okay. The doctors treating hypertension all day, they don't know what rouleau formation is. Well, they know what rouleau formation is from the books, but they don't know how it's caused by high-fat diets. They don't know, most of them, they don't know anything about the K factor for sodium and potassium. They really don't know the basics, okay? So I can tell you in all the internal medicine fields, that's the way it is. I'm not aware of a single one where they really have their knowledge base together because they don't know nutrition, epidemiology, toxicology. And those are the three most important things. So it's like, it's like a basketball player who doesn't know how to dribble. What is that? Okay, Richard Feynman continues. The ultimate test of your knowledge is the capacity to convey it to another person. Yeah, if you really know something, you should be able to have a conversation with it and articulate the nuance. And that's why the way they teach students nowadays is largely a joke. They just memorize a bunch of stuff, a list of things, and then they try to recognize the correct answer on a multiple choice test. But that's not real life. Let's say somebody comes and asks me, what's the significance of the findings on a brain MRI? I can't say, give me a multiple choice test. I'd say, let me see the films. Okay, here's this, and this is what the patient has. Okay, articulate it. Okay, always ask why. Yeah, the knowledge of what really matters in a domain is what causes what. And you should always be asking why, because a lot of times if you ask why, you can put things into a bigger context that makes it easy to solve the problem and even to solve the next problem. Like if you look at the abdomen, if you just know diverticulitis is one disease, appendicitis is another disease, hiatal hernia, gastroesophageal reflux disease is another disease, lower extremity varicose veins are another disease. That's a lot of thinking and a lot of memory, a lot of neurons to store all that information. If you just say those are all manifestations of abdominal pressure syndrome, it's easy because you've asked why. You can put it all together, and that's easy to remember too. Okay, Feynman continues. To really know something, you should be able to explain it to somebody else. Seek deep understanding, but eventually you've got to accept what you've got. Otherwise, you could end up with an infinite regress. It is possible to know when you're right way ahead of checking all the consequences. You can recognize it by its truth, by its beauty and simplicity. Yep. Okay. I learned a long time ago the difference between knowing something and the name of something. There's a big difference between knowing the name of something and really knowing that thing. Okay, that's it for the quotes from Richard Feynman. Hope that was interesting and helpful.